Hey everyone, my name's Jordan with AI Dash. I'm joined today with two of our utility experts, Robert and Bryan, here to have a discussion on the current state and future state of utilities here in North America. Robert, would you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jordan. My name is Robert Warwick. I'm a board certified master arborist, and I have experience as a senior vegetation program manager for Pacific Gas and Electric, and spent a lot of time working out in the field, working various projects for enhanced vegetation management routine, a lot of vegetation management work. So glad to be here.
Thanks, Robert. Bryan, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jordan. I'm Bryan Sonnier. I'm a licensed professional engineer here in the state of Texas. Before AI Dash, I was at Encore Electric out of North Texas for about 12 and a half years. I had several different roles there across technology and in distribution. So I spent some time in new construction management with the line extension process, serving new customers, spent some time on the engineering side. Also spent some time on the maintenance strategy side, helping prioritize capital plans and projects, and then also helping with our maintenance budgets on the vegetation management side as well.
It's great, great. Thank you guys so much for joining me today to dive into this conversation. We talked a little bit beforehand and at a very high level, thinking about the state that we're in now in 2022 and thinking about the way that utilities typically do business. Now, historically, utilities were responsible for really three things, right? Consistent, reliable, and safe power delivery for their customer base. And with the ever-changing and ever-evolving area of technology, there's a ton of solutions and a ton of different techniques to incorporate today's technology into the historic ways utilities typically do business. But I imagined there needs to be a balance of actionability with easy integration because utilities typically can't just move this giant cargo ship in a very short period of time. So finding that right balance of how does this actually integrate in the way our business units work today, I think is a very key thing to solve. What's been your experience with integrating new technologies into both your utilities?
Yeah, I'll start there with just a couple of comments. When I started my career, utilities were in the middle of advanced metering deployments, and I think you really nailed it, Jordan, when you talked about the constantly changing environment right now on the technology side. Our industry was relatively unchanged for about 100 years, and then all of a sudden there are more insights. There's more data from the network itself than we ever thought possible before. Learning how to incorporate that into planning and into strategy just opens the doors for all kinds of new opportunities. And it feels like everybody has some new solution. Every few months you hear about new products and services that are available to assist with things like that. I think the ease of integration has definitely been a pain point from the change management side. Utilities historically were slower to change. You called it the cargo ship, and are learning how to adapt and become more flexible. So, solutions that are more commercial off the shelf or ready to plug and play have a great value there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think time that you're adding a new technology to an industry that has used paper maps for decades takes time to do that, and having an application that's easy to use, something that is clear and straightforward visually to help somebody not get lost in the data, I think is really important, especially in today's technology market. Bryan was saying is there's always new technology coming out. And the good thing is that employees are much more used to using technology today. And so everybody's got a cell phone, everybody's been using a cell phone. A lot of the applications are mobile based, so you can still use your cell phone. And so if you're able to operate Google Maps and operate Facebook, then we can make it to where you can operate a lineman inspection, equipment inspection, a tree inspection. You can take pictures of tree work. So it really makes it easy to use. And I think that's part of the key to change management is showing the benefits and being able to make it easy to use. If something's hard to use, you'll find people going back to the paper maps.
No, that's great. And you both touched on an important point that I'm very curious on, and that's the difference between data and insights. What I really mean by that, data is the raw bulk of everything that we're going on. So whether that's from a remote sensing sense, we're trying to capture data on our assets, on our vegetation conditions, whatever that may be. And then there's insights. And I think the power of artificial intelligence has really unlocked this opportunity for utilities and all other sorts of industries to beat to that punch. So instead of having that human intervention with how do we interpret this, artificial intelligence can now really take that load off so we can get directly to the what, where, and why question. Do you think that there's a balance there, or is there one that's more important in the utility world?
The data itself, of course, drives all of those outcomes, but that data today typically lives in either a data warehouse or a data lake. And I'll tell you, if I'm going to the lake, I'm not 100% sure what I might catch, if I'll catch anything at all. So instead of going fishing, I would much rather just buy the fish. And that's where very supported, very robust solutions are helpful in some of those outcomes. So like a software solution like AI Dash, you can just buy the fish and you know exactly what you're going to get. And I think the answer to that question is that as important as the data is, it's not useful unless you can operationalize that data. And those are the kind of results that we provide.
That's great. That's great. So thinking about the ever-changing world that we live in, right? So we're just still currently dealing, but hopefully through the worst of the worst with COVID. But I know that's been a dynamic change from the way the utilities look at their customer base. So historically, when there was offices, we had calculated demand, calculated load. Now there's this almost customer perception of my home is now my office, and any interruption that I have at my home drastically affects not only my workday. So when you think the way that typical circuits are engineered, that creates a bit of an issue, right? So where this was a high priority district in the downtown area where we had the offices we can maintain their on, now those offices are all over utilities geographic base, right? Do you think regulators are actually looking at this and increasing any of the pressure on utilities to deliver more consistent, reliable power due to the changes in the workforce we've seen post-COVID?
Yeah, I think from a regulatory perspective is that they are expecting the same level of reliability that, if your office was a large office building in downtown Oakland or 100 homes in the Oakland Hills. And for a utility perspective, that shifts the burden from a small number of potentially large drawing circuits to increasing the number of miles that really need to be maintained. And so getting back to almost that data-driven approach, it almost requires the utility to become proactive, knowing where the potential avenues of failure are, knowing what the risk is, being able to mitigate that risk with a plan. And that gets back to using AI, using predictive technology to be able to go and look at the data and to be able to factor in all of these different variables and to be able to make the right decision. And so I think from a regulatory perspective is that they're going to continue their expectation. From a utility perspective is they now have a much more difficult task. They've got to do almost more with less. And so being able to be proactive, having a plan, and being able to execute that plan in an efficient manner will be able to get them to make sure they're reliable, make sure the regulators are happy. And we'll talk about wildfires in a little bit. There's a lot of regulatory look at wildfires and wildfire mitigation plans as well.
Yeah, and I just want to add there, Jordan, you were talking about the regulatory pressure there, but that home office scenario, I know that utilities feel a lot of pressure from the customers themselves now, because the customers are seeing those momentary outages that they didn't experience before. So depending on the state of your vegetation management and the area that those customers are in, those customers are escalating those issues to your local operations and area management groups. They're escalating issues to your city managers. So utilities have more pressure than ever before to manage the vegetation in just holistically the most effective way possible.
That's great. Great. Tying into that, the way that we typically think our vegetation management approaches are maintained, the typical approach of a cycle-based program, for example, I think one key thing that utilities and even the entire US is feeling right now, we're currently at an inflation rate of 8.6%. And I don't think 2 years ago, escalatory factors built in long-term contracts had 10% escalators in them. So were you guys feeling pain of we had this set amount of money, but we could not accomplish what we initially had planned? So stretching that dollar further must be an internal debate consistently going on in your vegetation management operations. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think budget is one of the few factors to really consider: budget, reliability, liability, safety. And so doing more with less is, I think, the phrase of the day. We've got to be able to increase reliability, decrease liability. We've got to be able to work and cut more trees and harden more equipment and prepare for wildfires with the same amount of dollars or less. And with gas prices the way they are, with inflation going the way it is, there's a lot of efficiency factors that with current management plans across the utility industry, there are gaps in efficiency. And so using technology and being able to leverage that will invariably bring in efficiencies.
Sure. And I think on the budget side, a solution like AI Dash gives you insights to say, hey, we were taking a circuit trim approach and trimming an entire feeder comprehensively. With the insights that we provide, you can segment those feeders into protection zones or however it works on your system. And we can help select areas that could be deferred to the following year or pull in areas that are growing faster than expected based on how we're modeling the tree growth along those feeders. So that takes some of the cloudiness out of the crystal ball when you're looking at projecting those VM budgets. You have much higher certainty in what needs to be done, and more importantly, when it needs to be done.
Yeah, that's a great point, Brian. One of the toughest decisions to have to make is what circuits or what vegetation or what system hardening isn't happening this year because of the budget. And that is something that keeps people up at night. That is something that causes stress at work. And so being able to have a platform that gives me the information and tells me what each circuit is, what each segment is in terms of criticality score, in terms of knowing what the risk is, allows program managers to be able to make the best decision. So that way regional management and executives are able to provide the tools for the people on the ground to be able to make the best decision possible. And so instead of arbitrarily or thinking that you're making the best decision in terms of what trees to push off, we can look at the data and say, yes, this tree is a low risk currently. And if it doesn't get worked for 12 months, the risk only increases slightly versus another area that has an extreme amount of risk, potentially catastrophic wildfires. And so being able to put the right people at the right time will absolutely cut that budget and make sure that more gets done with less.
So that's an interesting point there, because when we think about climate change and what we're actually realizing now at this accelerating rate of the increased frequency, the increased severity of things like wildfires and storms that are impacting all aspects of North America, I'm sure that decision of now we're faced with this inflationary measure, these constraining budgets, we have to figure out how to optimally push and pull some of those decisions. And I'm sure the decision gets even harder to make when you think about, what if this is the next wildfire? What if this could have been the next storm outage that we could have avoided? What challenges have those brought to utilities when we think about the increased severity and frequency of wildfire and storms?
I know that California is a very different environment than Texas. In Texas, we have a lot of droughts. We have a lot of ignition conditions across parts of the state that stay high risk and are high risk for several months out of the year, typically. Something like a solution where you can check fuel loading in different areas. You can find bounding areas where you may have containment of a fire if there is an ignition event. Allows for a lot more proactive planning on the wildfire mitigation side. And Robert could probably talk a little more specifically about some of that. I know in Texas, we had the Eastland complex fires earlier this year in 2022, which were just devastating. It's not just a California risk. I think we'll continue to see increasing pressure around some of those wildfire risks and that kind of proactive planning going forward for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. That climate change it's fundamentally shifted the way the industry looks at risk. It's like night and day. And it's not just California, it's not just the West Coast, it's a worldwide thing. It's Australia is struggling with bushfires that in the past would have ended up being carbon neutral because they were burning at a low enough frequency and temperature that grasses and things were growing back. There was enough rain to where it would take a shorter amount of time for these devastating fires to actually grow back and become healthy again. And so now they're seeing that it's taking 10, 20, 30 years because there's not enough water. And so the plants aren't growing back as fast. And the same thing's happening across the West Coast. And so as climate change happens, it intensifies tree mortality. It causes greater risk. And it's almost becoming an exponential amount of risk that continues to grow. And so being able to have the data on where forecasts are for potential insect infestations, what tree health looks like across a utility's service territory, what the forecast is for that, having that kind of data and being able to put that into a system allows people at any kind of level to be able to make the best decision. And so there are tens of thousands and probably 100,000 or more. Who knows how many employees are out there? I have not done the research in terms of utility workers, but I personally have never met a utility worker that didn't care about their job, that didn't know that they were providing service to customers, that they were actively out there trying to prevent fires, to prevent fall-ins, to make sure that people are safe and taken care of, and that these people work in their homes, they work in their neighborhoods. And so if we give them the tools that they need to do their job and clear and concise expectations, then we'll be amazed at what we can accomplish. And that might mean less miles driven because we're able to give tree health data. It might be that less trees need to be cut this year because it's 7 feet away and it doesn't need to be more or less than 4, and it only has to be 4 feet. And so a tree crew is going to go cut that when it doesn't need to be cut. And so dollars are being spent. So I think being able to have that information really opens up everything.
Great. So when we think about technology, we think about data, we think about insights. How do you feel that some of these innovative solutions can actually play to the liability that all utilities are facing right now that's on their shoulders? We've seen what happened with PG&E. We're seeing these different cases within the justice system. So liability is also always on the mind of utilities. So as they're trying to be proactive and take this data-driven approach, does technology play a factor in there of making them more comfortable or at least defining that decision to justify their actions?
Yeah, absolutely. Liability is probably one of the 3 most important things that utilities look at, and reducing liability by doing system hardening, by ensuring that vegetation is clear from conductors, by making sure that everything is taken care of, is a job that is done every single day. And the risky thing is that there exists strict liability states where even if a utility does everything that they're supposed to, they could still be potentially liable for whatever a good, healthy pole without any kind of damage that's been properly inspected could still fall over in a storm and could still cause a spark, and they might still be liable for a fire. And with that comes the difficulty of acquiring wildfire insurance, which some places you just can't get it. And you're in an area where a utility is going to be held liable for anything that happens and you're not able to get wildfire insurance, then it's one tree could cause one fire, which could cause a bankruptcy. And so that amount of risk it's terrifying, because that means, that's people's jobs, that's people's investments. There's a lot that goes on with that. And so being able to have data and put together a plan of action for a wildfire mitigation plan, for example, being able to use a data-driven approach, use forecasting, use weather technology, use all of the tools available into one dashboard gives regulatory agencies confidence that utilities are working and actively working a plan. Will a plan ever be 100%? Probably not, because humans are involved. But having a plan that actively reduces risk from the riskiest to the least riskiest areas based on a number of critical factors, I think shows the regulators and shows future courts, if anything happened, that they were doing their best. And so that can reduce liability by using data the right way.
And I think on the liability side, we need to talk about more than just wildfires as well. You have liability from storms blowing through. If there are hazard trees, if there's like a dead or decaying tree that's falling on a line and pulling that energized line down, if there's hot spots that need to be trimmed back that are pulling a line down, coming into contact with a fence, situations like that can be identified through analytics and give you some of those additional insights. That's helping on the liability side as well to reduce some potential concerns. But at the end of the day, it's all about better customer service and doing the right things for customers. And utilities, every single utility is safety oriented and is always safety first. And that's really what all this comes down to on the liability side, is keeping both your employees, your contractors, and the general public as safe as possible.
So we outlined some of the challenges of this ever-changing world we're living in. And I want to talk about something that utilities are focused on, and rightfully, and that's the goal of decarbonization. That's the goal of net zero. We can see there is a ton of companies and utilities alike that have pledged and committed to being net zero by 2050. I think one of the ongoing struggles right now is when we think about the electrification of vehicles and cars on an aging infrastructure, this brings up the constant balance of demand, load, and generation, and thinking about how do all three of these balance as we're trying to completely reinvent ourselves from the generational side. What do you think utilities are going to do to help meet that?
Yeah, Texas is a little different environment. So we're deregulated here in the state. So generation, transmission, distribution, and then the billing companies are all split out separately. So Robert may have a better answer as far as the more vertically integrated IOUs. In Texas, I think the push towards environmental social governance issues is a very serious issue for companies and for investors. So the more that you can demonstrate that you don't just have a sustainability report that's getting posted on an investor relations page once a year, but it's something that you're proactively engaging in and it's an area where you're trying to improve. We have the tools that can assist with that.
Yeah, it's actually an incredibly interesting topic. Europe is leading the pack on this decarbonization. And so from a utility perspective is being able to look at all of the assets the utility has to be able to reduce their carbon emissions and how many tons of CO2 are released by utility with miles driven every single year, how much equipment is being replaced at a time in which it might not need to be replaced because there's somebody already out there and there's no plan on when they're going to go. So there's a lot of inefficiencies built into the system. Just in the United States alone, there's 700,000 miles of transmission corridors. And so at an average width of 30 feet, that's something like 4,000 square miles of potential carbon capturing and carbon sequestering land, which you're able to, with a proper integrated vegetation management plan, be able to use that as part of a carbon balancing system. And I think the future of hopefully would be that utilities and just corporations in general have an idea of what their carbon footprint looks like and are actively making plans to mitigate that. And looking at something like SMUD, the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, they're actually working on becoming carbon neutral by 2030, I believe. And so they're using a combination of wind and solar. And so having something with a data-driven AI approach might be something beneficial to a group like that are really making really incredible pushes. And so I know that's something that is really important in California, and they're taking that more European model of looking at all assets and how to really be as efficient as possible.
Yeah, that's very interesting too, because I don't think that's something that's talked about enough when you look at your natural capital and some of those real estate assets that utilities own. There's opportunities there to offset if we improve pollinator habitat, improve the sustainability, the biodiversity, and the overall habitat of those assets. There is a large opportunity that can fit into that current carbon footprint plan of how are we going to reach this and be completely net zero by X point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you guys have anything that you want to talk about?
There are other benefits to a solution like AI Dash. Let's talk just a little bit about maybe the maintenance dollars and the capital budget side of things just a little bit. Of course, what you want to do, and we've touched on this already, is maximize your O&M so that you're trimming as much as possible at as low of a cost as possible. But there are some opportunities that get overlooked sometime with capital. Say that you have a distribution automation program and you have thousands of locations where you have traditional fuses that are getting replaced with reclosing fuses. Using AI Dash and that satellite intelligence, you could look at all those fuse locations very quickly, and you could say, man, this fuse is in the middle of a bunch of trees. Let's move it upline 3 spans, still protecting the same zone of customers, but saving yourself those potential upline outages because it's in the middle of those trees. So you can do that. Typically, we would make those changes when that project gets built or as part of the design process. But being able to do that proactively on the front end of all your planning saves a lot of time and a lot of rework and a lot of headaches with your construction resources out in the field as well. Another thing you can look at is you can capitalize those dollars on either side of that span very often. So if you're replacing cross arms, if you're doing those like fuse or recloser upgrades, you don't want to miss any opportunities where you can trim spans as part of your capital budget, because that means even if it's just a few hundred spans, that's work that then doesn't need to hit your O&M that you can justify on the capital side as part of those projects.
It's great. It's great. We love to get the opinions of experts that have worked, lived, and diligently innovated in the space. And when we think about these technology solutions that are coming out there, when we think about the benefits of remote sensing and taking a satellite-based approach to as you outlined, Bryan, not just vegetation management, but unlocking those synergies within your engineering and your construction departments, and then ultimately integrating this even further into the end goal of sustainability and decarbonization. I think there's so many possibilities and pathways here for utility to take that next step and innovate into the future.
Yep. And my favorite takeaway from all of this is that the satellite technology is only maturing over time as well. So the imagery resolution keeps getting crisper, the availability, just the turnaround time on image acquisition gets faster and faster as there are more constellations of satellites up in the air, and the machine learning models that we have just continue to get smarter as they learn more. This is a good future-proof solution that I'm very excited to see grow and develop over the next few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Integration from the O&M and capital projects and actual construction linemen with vegetation management and having a system-wide approach and working everything together, I think we'll see tremendous gains in improvements in efficiencies and safety and reliability. And so I think there's a great future ahead with the use of satellite technology to really be that foundation and that backbone.